Hello and welcome to the Mitchell Gallery's online exhibition, Floating Beauty, Women in the Art of Ukiyo-e, on loan to us through the Reading Public Museum in Reading, Pennsylvania. We appreciate their willingness to allow us to convert their traveling exhibition to an online format. I'm Lucinda Edinburgh, and I'm the art educator for the Mitchell Gallery, and I'm pleased to speak to you about this interesting period of Japanese history and art. Ukiyo-e literally translates to pictures of the floating world and is a Japanese art form that flourished during the Edo period from 1603 to 1867. This period marked drastic social, political, and economic change in Japan as the country was brought under the military control of the Tokugawa shogunate. This shogunate brought peace and prosperity and was established after a victory at the Battle of Sekigahara, which actually ended the civil wars of the period that followed the collapse of the previous shogunate. As a result, this created a strong economy in which agricultural production was emphasized and commerce was expanded. The new regime reordered the social structure, dividing citizens into four classes, between which mobility was strictly forbidden. So you'll see examples of these distinctions in the prints in this collection. At the top were the samurai warriors, and below them were the farmers, then artisans, and finally the merchants. The aristocratic class, made up of the ruling family and his daimyos, or regional lords, lived outside of this new system. The ranking was based on a Confucian ethic that prized contribution to society and what philosophers described as moral purity, surprisingly not wealth. So for the contributions to society, samurai protected the people, farmers grew the food that fed the people, and the artisans created the tools and products used by the people. But because the merchants created nothing and just lived off the exchange of goods, they were relegated to the lowest social rank. Ironically, because of this new economic boom, the merchant class also became the richest class. The shogun found the lower classes distasteful and morally impure and passed anti-chonin, which were townsmen of the merchant and artisan classes. It passed laws that strictly regulated how the chonin could spend their money, dress, where they could live, and the quality of goods they were allowed to purchase. As one would expect, the unfair restrictions created tension and fostered resentment toward the ruling class. So, in order to prevent a revolt, the shogun authorized the creation of Edo's pleasure district, known as the Yashawara, in 1617. And here we see a map in 1846 of this district. It was a small walled section outside of the city and was only accessible down a long road or by boat. And it was in the Yashawara that the courtesans lived and worked. Kabuki theater was performed, and the lower classes could show off their wealth and engaged in decadent activities, otherwise banned in a very conservative Japanese society. This new urban culture came to be known as the floating world, which was a term that described this new hedonistic style of attending kabuki plays and patronizing brothels and frequenting Yashawara. The floating world brought happiness to citizens suffering under the new class system of the shogunate, and it reflected the sentiment that life is transitory and to indulge in life's earthly pleasure was the proper way of life. The ukiyo-e art form emerged with this new floating world, and artists depicted a range of subjects, including samurai warriors, kabuki actors, folklore, literary scenes, landscapes and travel series, and historical events. But no genre was ever as popular or as well represented as the Bijinga. These are pictures of beautiful women. The image of the Bijin, beautiful woman, was the feminine ideal, and these beauties were passive, attentive, and demure. And looking beyond their obvious beauty, these women can give us some insight into the treatment and social standing of women in an age where societal pressures were significant and the government was oppressive. While ukiyo-e artists gave us a perfect vision of these women, their realities were often very harsh. And so the works from the Reading Public Museum help to tell the story of these women from all walks of Japanese society united in their struggle against the status quo. The dynamic new urban culture of the floating world was popular among the shonen, the townsmen, and centered on the yashiwari, and so the ukiyo-e artists most commonly produced their work in the form of woodblock prints, which were inexpensive to create, cheap to purchase, and lent itself to producing large quantities of each image. The production team for a woodblock print included the engraver, who would carve the image onto the block of wood, the printer who inked and printed the image, and the publisher who marketed the images and commissioned reprints when a print or series was successful. So for this process, when the artist finished drawing his design on paper, an exact copy was made and placed down on a block of cherry wood, and the engraver would trace the image onto the block through the paper, which destroyed it. This is known as the key block and contained only the outline of the images. And you can see just a black line art in this work, which we actually have the wood block for. These prints were used to carve additional blocks, one for each color for the final image. And after a few samples were drafted, the images were printed by the printer and then marketed and sold by the publisher. So as long as the wood block survived, which you can see here is a sample, popular prints could be reprinted and sold as many times as necessary. There's no way to know for sure how many copies of each print were made, but there's evidence to suggest that maybe 200 or more was usually the first print run. Many prints had a few editions if they were extremely popular, especially like those of Hokusai and Hiroshige, both who are represented in this exhibition, and they could have as many as 20 editions. So the number of prints and editions was ultimately decided by the publisher, as he was the one that commissioned the prints. So this is actually taken from one of Hokusai's designs and is based on the 47 Ronin, and you can see the intricacy of the carving of this block. So we get into one of our first images, and this is done by Kukagawa Eisen, and this is Lady holding an oil lamp and depicts a bijin, or a beautiful woman, burning a oil lamp. And her hair and makeup were extremely important to the Japanese concept of beauty. And with the rise of the merchant class during the Edo period, shonen wives spent a lot of money on their appearance in an attempt to outdo each other. So they were very competitive. The woman here is depicted wearing a kimono, a large obi, which is belted in the back. The position of that is very important, and gita, her shoes. Married women wore short sleeves, while unmarried women wore longer sleeves. The ideal woman had pale skin, and women used a lead oxide powder in order to lighten their faces and necks and chests, and lead, of course, is toxic. Married women plucked and repainted their eyebrows higher on the forehead in a practice known as hikimayu. And then hairdressers were very popular among the wives of the merchants and upper classes. They actually followed the trends of the yashiwara. These women would get elaborate updos outfitted with combs and other accessories, and then they would use wooden headdress to sleep at night so their hairstyles would last as long as possible. So nothing like the silk scarf. You can see here that she's got blackened teeth as well. I've pulled up another image so you can see a bit of the practice of teeth blackening, which was also performed by married women. The women were required to drink sake, or tea dyed black by iron, which, by the way, is not very tasty. And in order to maintain the color, the dye had to be ingested every day until it had a permanent effect. This is quite the opposite of the bleaching that we do for teeth today. This scene by Utagawa Toyokuni 1, Mother and Daughter by the Sea, is part of a triptych, that is a series of 3 prints. Unfortunately, the other 2 panels from this scene are missing. but it explores the relationship between a mother and daughter as they stroll along the beach. And you notice the daughter is just really a smaller version of her mother. So while texts like the Onna Daigaku claimed that women were so incompetent that they couldn't be trusted to raise their own children, this really wasn't practical. It fell to the mother to educate her daughter in the ways of the household and teach her the skills expected, of a young lady and eventually a bride. The education of her sons, however, were left, entirely to the male members of the household. And so when a young woman married, it was her duty to serve her husband and her in-laws, and she would use the skills passed down to her by her mother to set up her household. Loyalties changed a little bit. Her first loyalty then became to her in-laws, and her own parents sort of took second peer, or maybe even third, because after the husband. The Onna Daigaku was this treasure box of women's learning, was written by Kabuki Dancer, and was probably the most famous moralist of Japan. This volume was a half-dogmatized precept, basically exclusively intended for women. It was the most popular of his works and remained so for nearly 2 centuries, but it had a tremendous effect on the daily lives of Japanese women prior to the opening of Japan during the mid-19th century. This slide after Kitagawa Utamaro is a 20th century copy of a print by Utamaro from the series Fashionable Comparisons of Precious Children. Here, a mother is reading while her child falls asleep on her lap. Another girl, maybe the woman's sister, is kneeling beside her and writing a poem on an anton, which is the lantern. During the Edo period, it was thought that a child's education should begin as early as possible, and overprotective parents were considered a hindrance to the child's development. It was the wife of the duty to educate her children and to prepare for them for adulthood with the expectation that they would one day take over the family business and carry on the family lineage. The artist Kitagawa Utamaro, who lived from 1753 to 1806, is best known for his very slender and graceful bijinga pictures. He's known for capturing the private lives of Edo's women, mothers, and courtesans alike. And he was extremely popular in Japan, but was also very popular in Europe, including Mary Cassatt, who was particularly taken with his woodblock prints. In 1804, Utamaro ran into legal trouble with the Tokugawa shogunate for producing prints related to a historical scene. The print depicted the 16th century ruler Hideyoshi with his wife and courtesans, entitled Hideyoshi and His 5 Concubines. You have to remember that there was censorship and prints had to be approved, and this work was considered disrespectful, so Utamaro was sentenced and imprisoned for a short time, and some believe that this really broke his spirit because he died in Edo only a couple of years later. This piece by Utamaro is a genre scene, a scene of everyday life, and it was a popular subject of his, and he's chosen again to depict a mother and daughter. The mother is threading a needle while her daughter practices playing the shamisen. Society scorned idleness in women at any age and at any class. Servants would engage in a variety of tasks like cooking and planning meals and making clothing and bedding and waiting on husbands and in-laws and entertaining guests. And women of the upper class participated in this. Young girls were expected to be obedient and gentle and follow in the ways of their mothers. This print by Kitagawa Utamaro is the far right panel of a triptych illustrating the 6 jewel rivers, Muda-Mamagawa, a popular subject in the Ukiyo-e genre that represents 6 rivers and 6 provinces, each associated with a classical poem. So this print represents the province of Musashi, and the Tama River can be seen in the background. This river was famous as a place to bleach clothing, and the depictions of the Tama River always include women doing their laundry. Laundry was yet another duty for women in the household, and so after water was placed in a bucket, natural soap consisting of wood ash and fat was used, and the clothing was rubbed against a wooden board. Traditionally, a kimono would be taken apart before it was washed and then stretched and then painstakingly resewn by hand. This process, of course, was very expensive and time-consuming and was a luxury that only the upper classes could afford. This print by Hiroshige is another depiction of the Tama River, and two peasant women are washing their clothing in the Tamagawa village, while across the banks you can see a pair of men fishing and hunting for shellfish, and you can also see Mount Fuji in the distance. I wanted to point out a distinctive tool that Hiroshige uses to create some depth and perspective, and that's with that dark band up at the top of the print. That allows to create some distance. The typical Edo period peasant family usually consisted of the married family, of the couple with 2 or 3 children, and sometimes the husband's parents and unmarried sisters. During the rule of the shogunate, farmers were forbidden from transacting in any other business. So this dedication to agriculture really allowed the economy to expand. The goal for these families was not wealth, but financial independence and the continuation of the family line, which brought honor to the household. Men and women had different expectations through typically working side by side in the fields. In the peasant household, women were also tasked with managing the household, while their upper class components would have servants to assist them. In addition to the house duties and farm labor, the wife was expected to take care of the children and perform work outside of the ie, such as weaving, paper making, or peddling goods. This other print by Hiroshige of ferry boats on the Samida River is also part of a triptych, which was probably fastened together sometime in the 20th century, and the Reading Museum says that they were most likely not purchased at the same time or even printed in the same series edition. But once an entire set had been acquired, they were usually laid out for viewing. But Edo period collectors weren't concerned about acquiring a matching set made within the same edition. In these prints, ferry boats are transporting groups of women across the river, known in the Edo period as the Great River, which ran along the eastern edge of the city. Because the river was so often utilized for transportation of goods, markets were usually not far from the ferry crossings, and women frequented these markets to buy groceries and other necessities for their households. If you look at the women's attire, you can tell us that they're most likely from the lower classes. Townswomen wore their sashes tied behind them, while high-ranking women wore theirs in front to show that they didn't labor. A large sash tied in the front would also get in their way as they tried to work. So some might even be servants collecting goods for their masters. This print by Tamagawa Bunro is a depiction of a young couple with falcons, known as takagari or falconry, which dates as early as the 4th century in Japan by Emperor Nintoku. This was a very popular sport, really restricted to the wealthy, but the emperor's daughter Kochiku was actually the first female falconer recorded in history and was well renowned for her skill. Since it was the popular sport of the noble class during the Edo period, the sport was costly due to the breeding and care of birds, and also required a large amount of land, and so this was only possible for the very rich. The Tokugawa Ieyasu also enjoyed falconry, and he used it as a symbol of his authority, but he also placed restrictions on which ranks of creatures a samurai or daimyo could hunt. So common people were kept out of falconry. Their interest in the subject led itself into prints by other artists, including Hokusai and Hiroshige, Kayosa, and Bunro. The slide on the left by Suzuki Haranobu, Courtesan and Attendant in Interior. You can see the courtesan large in front holding a note in her hand. And courtesans were expected to be entertainers. They were skilled conversationalists, musicians, poets, and game players. Behind the courtesan are musical instruments, game boards and writing equipment, all an allusion to the skills a woman of pleasure had to know in her profession. In front of her stands her kamuro. Kamuro were young girls, usually between the ages of about 5 and 9, who would act as attendants to their old sister courtesans. These attendants also functioned as a status symbol because only the highest ranking courtesans were permitted to have a kamuro. Before the 16th century, courtesans were only allowed one attendant, but it became fashionable to have two, and they would be dressed alike and given matching names. So often was the case that these young girls were sold into the profession by poor parents and then eventually would go on to become full-fledged courtesans themselves. In addition to running errands and other mundane tasks, the kamuro was in charge of promoting her sister outside the brothel, and if she saw a client in the street, she would hang on to him and tell him that her sister missed him and was dying for a visit. And she was also often approached by clients to ask after the affections of her sister, and so it was her duty to convince the client that her older sister was totally in love with him. The artist, Haranobu, was a most inventive Japanese designer in ukiyo-e art because he was the first to produce full-color prints, tossing out the former modes of just 2- and 3-color prints. He used many special techniques and depicted a wide variety of subjects from classical poems to the contemporary beauties. And like many artists of his day, Haranobu also produced a number of shunga, or erotic images. He was greatly imitated during his lifetime and for even a period after his death. The print on the right is after Kayunaga, but was done in his style perhaps by one of the students in the Torii school. When compared to a print attributed to the master himself, we can see that the female figure is tall and lean, and there's a similar color palette with a dramatic black kimono in the central figure. The courtesan is the tallest woman in the group and stands surrounded by her attendants, and her position marks her status in the group. Notice that she wears her obi in the front, and as you remember, traditionally obi are worn in the back, but courtesans wore theirs in the front to signal their sexual availability. And the attendant to her left is a shinzo, a newly made courtesan in training. Shinzo were usually between the ages of 13 and 23 years and served as attendants to mature courtesans, and the girls to the right of the courtesan are the kamuro. This print by Kitagawa Udamaro is titled Courtesan, Hana Ogi and Ogaya with Attendant. The attendant is to the left, and to the right is Hana Ogi of Ogaya. Ogaya translates to House of the Fan, which was a brothel in the Yashiwara. Extremely popular in her day, Hana Ogi was known as a woman of great poise and artistic accomplishment, and she was called the flower of the Ogaya and was depicted by many ukiyo-e artists. So here she smokes a pipe, with a quiet moment with one of her attendants, and pipe smoking among courtesans was very common. This print from a triptych by Utagawa Kunisada, also known as Toyokuni 3, is Arunyu of the Okamatoya. This print is from the left side of the triptych, entitled Spring from Four Seasons, created by Kunisada. You have the courtesan Arunyo of the Okamatoya Pleasure House, and then the center and right panels of the triptych pictured to the side include other courtesans of the same house. And you notice they're sumptuously dressed in their decorative kimono, the talgita, that's the traditional wooden sandal with the elevated wooden base, and the kanzashi, which is their decorative hair ornaments. Kunisada was also known as Toyokuni 3 and was probably the most popular, prolific, and commercially successful designer of ukiyo-e woodblock print in 19th century Japan. He developed an early talent for painting and drawing, which impressed Toyokuni, the great master of the Utagawa school and prominent designer of kabuki and actor portrait prints. Somewhere around 1800 or thereafter, Kunisada was accepted by Toyokuni I as an apprentice in his workshop. So, in keeping with the tradition of Japanese master-apprentice relations, He was then given the official artist name of Kuni Sada, the first character of which was derived from the second part of the name, Toyo Kuni. During his lifetime, he was even more popular than Hokusai and Hiroshige and Kuniyoshi, who were all contemporaries. This image, Tsukioka and Hinakoto of the Hyogoya, was created by Kikagawa Eisen. Eisen was the greatest and most prolific of the followers of Utamaro, and he attempted to carry on the style of Utamaro's Bijin after his master's death. What's interesting is that he was left-handed, which was really most unusual in Japan at this time. Depicted here are two courtesans from the tea house. In the early Edo period, the sancha or tea house waitresses would often engage in unauthorized prostitution. These sancha were mid-range in price and were not allowed to refuse a customer, and their efforts turned a moderate profit. Unhappy with the competition, the brothel owners pressured the shogunate to shut down the tea houses in 1666, so the sancha were then incorporated into the yashawara under the condition that they would not be paid for 3 years in punishment for stealing business from the courtesans. So you can see this is a serious business. These waitresses were then known as chusan, or second-rate courtesans, who would sit on display in a latticed parlor and wait for customers to approach. Eventually, their popularity grew so much that by the next century they were equal in status to the high-ranking courtesans of the yashawara. This lovely print by Utagawa Kunisaga, or Toyo Kuni III, is a courtesan that's standing resplendent in this elaborate kimono, and she's paused there by a fence. This print is known as a narimonoi, or a picture of walking slowly in a procession. Parts of the duty for the high-ranking courtesans was this daily procession through the streets with her retinue of attendants. She would dress in her most fashionable kimono and tall gita, and she was usually accompanied by her kimuro, her shinzo, male attendants, and these processions became so popular that the wives of the daimyo and other high-ranking officials would visit the yashiwari just to attend the parade and copy the fashion of the courtesans. Some women began to even tie their obi in the front, a style formerly only worn by the courtesans to signal their sexual availability. But walking in procession in these impossibly high gita, these would be, I guess, like platform shoes now, and the restrictive kimono required a great deal of poise and skill. So if she should fall or trip, she was required to go to the nearest tea house and send her attendants home to bring her a new outfit, and then she would donate her current outfit to the tea house and additionally pay the tea house staff for their assistance. So there's a lot of courtesy and ceremony involved even in this parade. This print is from Volume 1 of the book Mirror of Beautiful Women of the Greenhouses. The greenhouses refers to the great brothels of Edo, and you can see 5 courtesans here from that house. This book has been cited as one of the most outstanding examples of illustrated books made in the Ukiyo-e tradition. Volume 1 represents spring and summer, Volume 2, autumn and winter, and then Volume 3 has verses on the 4 seasons written by the courtesans pictured within the book. This was a book jointly designed by Shigemasa and Shunsho, and the artists were so successful in blending their styles for the sake of uniformity, it's really unclear as to which artist is responsible for which illustrations. But you can see that this is a quiet moment inside the brothel when the women are relaxing together. One woman smokes a pipe, the tobacco pouch on the ground near her, another fixes her hair, and the 2 women in the foreground play a hand game while a third is watching. This slide of a Kabuki Dancer by Utagawa Toyo Kuni I, the master, is an actor print and is actually the name of a actor in character as a woman. Kumasaburo was an onagata and exclusively played female roles. It was the duty of the onagata to make the audience believe that he was a woman, and Most skilled actors would even make young men fall in love. The Onogata would use a falsetto voice and bend back his knees and back to appear smaller. And of course, he had to appear elegant and poised at all times, and movements were tightly controlled. His fingers had to be kept together, and he took tiny steps with his knees pressed together and his toes pointed inward. It took many years to perfect this art form, and it was not uncommon for Onogata in their 50s and 60s to be tasked with fooling the audience into thinking that he was a young, beautiful woman. This print is a representation by Utagawa Kunisada, Toyokuni 3, of one of the 7 legends concerning Ono no Komachi. Komachi was a lady-in-waiting in the imperial court, and her story is included in no plays, and legend has it that she had raven hair that cascaded to the floor, a face like a blossom, and eyebrows painted into perfect crescent moons. Her name has come down through the ages as Japan's all-time femme fatale. And she was not just another pretty face. She was brilliant and accomplished, as well as powerful and tough-minded. Her passionate poetry was held in high regard. Unfortunately, unlike Cleopatra and other femme fatales, she was cursed and loses her beauty at a young age. In this legend of Parrot Komachi, the retired emperor has sent a poem of pity to the aged Komachi, who is now 100 years old and living in seclusion, and the poem asks Komachi if she remembers the days that she spent at his palace. So she's skilled in the art of poetry, and Parrot replies, which is a practice in Japanese poetry. The print to the right of Grave Post Komachi in another of the legends, 2 traveling monks come across the aged Komachi, who has seated herself on a grave marker, and they protest her disrespectfulness, but her quick wit subdues them in saying that were I in heaven, the stupa were an ill seat, but here in the world without, what harm is done? So as soon as she confesses her name, she's overtaken by the spirit of her former suitor, who reenacts his courtship of her. And so Komachi promised to accept his proposal if he appeared at her house every night for 100 nights. So he did this, but then on the 99th night he died. So possessed by his ghost, she performs a dance describing his miserable visits and agonizing death. This image by Toyokuni 3, The Sacred Tree, is a reference to Chapter 10 of the Tale of the Jinji. The Tale of the Jinji is Japan's oldest novel and was written by a female author, Murasaki Shikibu, around 1020. Murasaki was a lady-in-waiting to the Empress Akiko and was most skilled in calligraphy, painting, and poetry. She was well educated in New Chinese, then the language of the government, and considered to be a male-only discipline. The book has 54 chapters and traces the story of Prince Jinji as he navigates court life and has multiple romantic affairs. Since the death of his wife, Jinji has neglected one of his companions, and the lady, distraught by his rejection, is preparing to leave when Jinji hears this and goes out at night to look for her, and he finds her, and she reluctantly lets him in, and he offers her a branch of the sacred tree as an apology. This print is from the series Young Murasaki's Contest of Jinji Pictures, and the sacred tree referred to in the title can be seen in the left corner of the print. This final image by Toyokuni 3, The Tale of the Jinji and the 47 Ronin, was a book, a picture book actually by Kunisada, that contained the 2 stories. One was a parody of the Tale of Jinji and the Tale of the 47 Ronin, and the pages here are from the Tale of Jinji. Traditionally, woodblock printed books were produced on washi paper, printed on one side and then folded in half to create a leaf with printing on both sides. It was then bound together and read from right to left. So you can see the crease and the fold in this particular image. You can see the sumptuous kimono and print, the Gita, the big fan, and just a great typical illustration from this period. We thank many individuals and institutions that have supported the Mitchell Gallery, especially during this COVID and online period. Please refer to our website for other events and activities, and we look forward to the reopening of the Mitchell Gallery in the fall of this year. In the meantime, stay healthy, be safe.